So again, welcome to this first ever webinar sponsored by the Father Ignatius Rapolo Memorial Endowment. Let me say just a few words about the Memorial Endowment. Uh, it was founded by three people who are here tonight: Father Doug Duson, Matt Russo, and Father Doug Brower, to honor Monsignor Father Rapolo, who served the sick and the poor and exercised collaborative leadership. Archbishop Gregory Aymond wrote about him, Father Rapolo, that he was a beloved priest in the Archdiocese of New Orleans who had a pastoral heart and truly gave of his life in a collegial and a collaborative way to strengthen the church among us. A little more about Father Ignatius Rapolo, that he was a humble servant of Christ and his people, and this was manifested in the self-sacrificing and generous way in which he ministered to the sick and to the poor. It's also manifested in the way he exercised leadership as a pastor of a parish and in other prominent positions in the archdiocese. He was committed to lay leadership, formation, and collaboration between priests and lay leaders. He was constantly pursuing further pastoral training for himself and promoting pastoral training for seminarians, deacons, laity, and priests, always offering his vision of a more inclusive church. And so the endowment that was founded again by Father Duson, Matt Russo, Father Doug Brower, is meant to carry on his vision. And we've carried it on in a number of ways. We've carried it on with weekend workshops. We've held 3 weekend workshops so far. We've carried it on by way of a grant to support parishes in carrying out the vision of Pope Francis in their particular ways. And that's another emphasis of the endowment, is to promote and help people understand and live out the vision of Pope Francis. And then it's being carried out again, like I say, tonight, through this first ever webinar. So again, welcome to this event. Tonight, the title of the purpose of our panel is to talk about environmental justice and the challenge it represents for us. This topic is increasingly important and increasingly recognized as important. Our speakers tonight are Father Fred Kammer, who is director of the Loyola University New Orleans Jesuit Social Research Institute. I also want to introduce Allison McCrary, who will serve also on the panel. She's a social justice movement lawyer and currently serves as a practitioner in residence at Wake Forest University's School of Divinity as justice advocate. And then finally, David Robinson Morris, who is director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier University, again here in New Orleans. All right. Well, I want to invite Father Fred Kammer to offer his opening reflections.
Good evening, folks. I'm going to try to lay out a little sort of theological background and framework for the panel tonight. But first, a little sort of localizing here in Louisiana, of which all of you will be familiar. But I like to go back to a story that my friend Rob Gorman, who was the director of Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux, told, which is he would tell people he knows a man who fishes where his father farmed. And it's just one example of the erosion of our Louisiana coastlands that we all know so well about. And I just like to remind us that sort of context for part of what we're thinking about, we in Louisiana. On May the 24th, in 2015, Pope Francis seemed to shock the world, according to the press and the media, by taking a strong moral stand on care of the environment and climate change. But the question I pose is, was it actually a new position of our church or a departure from church teaching? And what I want to answer that question myself is to say, well, not really, although it had a very Francis-like focus when he urged us to hear the cry of the earth together with the cry of the poor. And before going, though, to what Francis said in Laudato Si', that document, I want to give you a little bit of history about the church's position on the environment in recent decades. Contemporary environmental consciousness in the church received a kind of kickstart, you might say, from St. John Paul II in 1990 when he published the World Day of Peace message. The popes publish a World Day of Peace message around January 1, which is the World Day of Peace. They usually publish it a month earlier. And in 1990, Pope John Paul II, or Saint Pope John Paul II's peace message was called Peace with God the Creator, Peace with all of creation. And that statement, together with a number of statements that had come out of conferences of bishops in recent years, really moved the environmental question much more forward in formal church teaching. Now, there's been a lot of environmental activism going on for decades. I mean, I think, for example, of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, which was founded in 1923 and always worked on rural issues and farming issues and environmental issues. And other, I think of other grassroots Catholic groups as well, and church leaders at the local, national, and international levels who had spoken out before 1990. But John Paul's statement in 1990 kind of gave it that official stamp, if you want to say this, that it was okay for a Catholic to be green. A strong component of John Paul's focus was on stewardship, a term that we've heard a lot more since Vatican II, and stewardship in this case of the environment, drawing inspiration in his case from the scriptures and especially from the book of Genesis. John Paul argued that through the Genesis work mandate, when God says to Adam and Eve to subdue the earth, that human beings, us, that we image our Creator and that we share God's creative action, and that should be for us a font of deep spirituality. In John Paul's writing, he says, with the Lord, we become co-creators of the earth and the ways in which we have developed the earth and society over time, what I call and what I think he called creation given, so like the natural environment, and creation enhanced, all the ways in which we have developed all of the sciences and arts and engineering and construction and everything else we've done to enhance creation. So that was sort of John Paul sort of bringing the issue out into the fore. In 2008, so some years later, in another World Day of Peace message called The Human Family, a Community of Peace, Pope Benedict XVI introduced a new concept, which is what he called a covenant between human beings and the environment. In his 2009 encyclical a few years later, that was called Caritas in Veritate, or Love and Truth, or Charity and Truth, he developed a threefold responsibility in justice tied to the environment. It was, and I quote here, a responsibility towards the poor, towards future generations, and towards humanity as a whole. Pope Benedict, in framing the environmental concerns in terms of covenant, he actually took a big step from the stewardship position, because the stewardship model envisions sort of us as human beings against the rest of creation. But the covenant model was a more adequate approach to the fact that we are seriously tied to all of creation. We know this, like when we get sick from the weather and from other things, and now as we deal with the COVID reality, et cetera, that we are much more closely tied to all of creation than maybe the stewardship model offered us. But in Benedict's writing at that time, he decried the hoarding of energy and the stockpiling of energy that gives rise to exploitation and frequent conflicts between and within nations. He urged solidarity between developing countries, those we think of in the Southern Hemisphere, and the more highly industrialized countries. He argued for lowering, on the part of us especially, our energy consumption. He argued for increased research into alternative forms of energy and into redistribution. He emphasized, going back to John Paul, responsible stewardship, but he also emphasized duties to future generations, the importance of international joint action on environmental issues. We could reflect upon the US withdrawal from the Paris Treaty about that. And he argued for changing our lifestyles, for transparency and accountability for using up the shared resources of the earth, and for strengthening, again, that term, the covenant between human beings and the environment. He also underscored how many of the world's resources, this was a special angle, I think, from Pope Benedict, are, quote, squandered by wars. And so these are all, I think, important themes for us as we think about an upcoming election. In 2015, then, let's come back to Francis in Laudato Si. We had the first encyclical. I forgot to mention earlier, an encyclical originally was a letter from the Bishop of Rome to all the bishops in the world. But in the time of Pope John the 23rd, many of you will remember this. I see some grayer heads out there like me. Pope John addressed encyclicals to the bishops, the priests, the Catholic laity, and to all people of goodwill. And so this was the first encyclical in 2015 by Pope Francis that explicitly focused on environmental concerns. And with Pope Francis's focus, it tied environmental concern very closely to our concern for the poor. First, he presented the scientific consensus on climate change and other environmental threats, and how environmental degradation affects human life and society. I think back to Father Jim Carter, the longtime president of Loyola University here, a physicist who is still teaching physics at the age of 92. And Jim told me when he reviewed Laudato Si, that the science in the beginning of Laudato Si is very sound. This is not a question of political opinion as we sometimes hear in the news, but that this is the scientific consensus about the environment. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the Vatican has a group called the Pontifical Academy of Science, which brings together scientists from all over the world to advise the Pope and the papacy on questions of science. So for Francis, as Francis got into Laudato Si, he pointed out that it's the poor who usually pay the highest price for environmental destruction, whether it's the destruction of natural habitats or the erosion of farmlands or coastal flooding or the location of polluting factories. He also worked from the biblical account of creation as St. John Paul II had done. And from that, he teaches that the universe itself, all of the universe, reveals the divine to us. And that woven together in God's love for all creatures, we human beings are united, in his image was, as sisters and brothers on a wonderful pilgrimage across time. However, he argued that we're consuming the planet's limited resources, enthralled, as he puts it, by a technocratic paradigm that promises unlimited growth and is based on a belief in an infinite supply of the earth's goods. As such, Francis argues, we have no interest in more balanced levels of production, in better distribution of wealth, in concern for the environment, or for the rights of future generations. And he summarized that section by saying, maximizing profits drives these patterns. What we need, Pope Francis wrote, is an integral ecology, which understanding the connection between the social and environmental crises, that they are one, that approach would demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, to restoring dignity to the excluded, and to protecting nature, and that all of these are aspects of justice. I want to focus now a little bit more on Francis's strong theme, which is in a sense new in the sense of the intensity of the arguments he makes and the call on Catholics and all people to a deeper connection between environmental destruction and poverty. A critical look at this connection can help us to unlock the message of the whole document. As I say, this wasn't a new theme, but it had a lot of that Francis emphasis to it. And note that teaching at the hierarchical level was deeply influenced by the work of local Catholics. It didn't all just come out of Rome, but the work of local Catholics and other people of goodwill on issues of environmental preservation and environmental justice. Environmental justice is often spoken of as the connection between environmental degradation and its profound impact, especially on the poor and on minority communities. Francis does not use the image in Laudato Si, but one of the first ways I find to help people understand the connection between environmental destruction and the poor is likened to the practice of coal miners who keep a canary in the mine as a first warning of poisonous air. Because when the canary dies, get out of the mine. And so Francis emphasizes the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. He puts it this way. He says, many of the poor live in areas particularly affected. Here it is, particularly affected by the phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence is largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. Among the results, the Pope continued, is a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. Another example that Francis gives is how the world has a growing shortage of drinkable water, which is now reflected in what's called water poverty, especially affecting Africa. And I quote from him, where large sectors of the population have no access to safe drinking water or experience droughts which impede agricultural production. Humans then, who are poor, could be likened to those biological species which become extinct from environmental change and destruction. Francis further underscores the systemic linkage between environmental destruction and human destruction, born of the breakdown in our sense of the common good. He writes this, he says, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. And the common sign, he says, of the breakdown of both environments, that's environment, the natural environment and the social environment, is the plight of those who are poor, the billions of people who are affected by environmental damage and who suffer from the failures of our social and economic systems as well. And this prompts Francis to urge that, quote, a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Responsibility and causes. And he lays the responsibility for this double crisis on three key causes. The first is excess consumption, quote, where a minority believes that it has the right to consume in a way which can never be universalized, since the planet could not even contain the waste products of such consumption. Secondly, the second cause is the absence of a sense of the universal duty to the common good. And the third cause is a little fancy here in language, is an excessively anthropocentric view, a human view, a man-centered or human-centered view of the human person that, quote, continues to stand in the way of shared understanding and of any effort to strengthen social bonds. So those were his three underlying causes for the crisis we're now in. So there's much to discuss and reflect on tonight. I look forward to hearing from our other panelists and to our discussion afterwards.
All right. Thank you, Fred, so much. I want to invite David Robinson Morris to offer his reflections as part of this panel discussion.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That was great, Fred. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Center first, and then I'll move into these remarks. So the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier was created in 2018, so we're about 2 years old, and it was created to engage, support, and to promote innovative thinking across a multiplicity of contexts and across disciplines regarding race, class, systemic issues, and a faith that does justice toward a better understanding of issues impacting modern societies and vexing the human spirit. The center is a response to our calling at Xavier as a Black and Catholic institution of higher learning, the nation's only. It is, for us, the concretized point of intersection that brings together nearly 95 years of our history at Xavier. That history of combating and traversing oppressive systems, of triumphing in the face of adversity, of reclaiming our shared humanity, and educating and producing whole human beings who go out into the world prepared and ready to do justice no matter where they find themselves on the globe. Our work at the center is grounded in a social justice framework saturated in Catholic social teaching, and given my own areas of research, is imbued with the generative philosopraxis, as I like to call it, of Ubuntu, a South African communalist notion of a universal and shared humanity. Our philosophy is very simple. As an institution imbued with an abiding faith, and as a human family, we are compelled to recognize our shared humanity. we're compelled to recognize the depth of our seen and unseen connections to one another and the planet. And we have a mutual responsibility to work with and for one another to eliminate institutionalized domination and oppression in all its forms and its various mutations. This work, my work at the center, finds its purpose in one personal question. What does the Lord require of you? Micah 6:8 is my favorite scripture, and its words to me reveal the simplicity and crispness of God. It reveals what it means to be in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another, with ourselves, and with all of creation. The prophet's answer is very simple. The Lord requires us to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with her. What does it mean then to be a human being? This question grounds every aspect of my work as a scholar and as an activist and as a person of faith. What does it mean to be a drop of water in the sea of humanity stretching back millennia on this planet? This planet being held up in the heavens by the love of God in an environment we have named space, where neither space nor time exist. What does it mean to recognize that you and I are composed of all of those who came before us? What does it mean to realize that we are on the brink of losing this third rock from the sun, on the brink of polluting, consuming, and killing ourselves into extinction? What does it mean to be a human being? As a Black human being, a Black man, and a Black Catholic, my mind immediately locates the point of intersection, the point where environmental justice meets racial justice. At that point, they become one and the same. The call for global environmental justice and racial justice toll for me the bell of hypocrisy that only an active faith in the Spirit of God can quiet. The Holy Father, in the encyclical that Fred so wonderfully gave us an overview on, and in Fratelli Tutti, speak about the same coin viewed from each of its sides, in my opinion. They both ask, in light of who we know God to be, Spirit and truth, creator of the universe, omnipresent, found in all things, and as creatures of faith and conscience, what does the Lord require of us? What does it mean to be human beings created in image and in likeness? What does it mean to be a part of and to care for the human family? Here's what we know, taken directly from the Pope's encyclical. He writes of St. Francis. Francis shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. Pope Francis continues, the urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together, to seek a sustainable and integral development. For we know that things can change. It's an important point, for we know that things can change. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes us. His loving plan for us, or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Even while all hell is breaking loose across the globe, the Pope writes, humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Like Pope Francis, I believe that statement. However, we have some work to do nationally and globally about who we recognize as our brothers and our sisters, as full members of the human family. However, we have to begin to tell the truth, in my opinion, the unvarnished truth. One of my favorite authors is Christina Sharp, and she wrote In the Wake on Being in Blackness. And this is my favorite piece from this book. She says, and I quote, 500 years of slavery, scattered people of African descent all over the world, a dispersal enacted on us not as workers, adventurers, or bureaucrats, but as things. The story of how these stolen people became commodities, then became Black people and survived as such, is breathtaking and strange. How can this inexpressible loss be expressed in language? To follow that up, Black Catholic theologian M. John Copeland asserts that we all live and work in houses haunted by the ghost of slavery. We have to reckon with this. The church, too, has to reckon with her complicity in this Holocaust. We can still feel the impact of slavery, of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy in the church today. I want you to sit with these numbers for a minute. There are 69 million Catholics in the US. 3 million of those Catholics are Black. Of the 36,500 priests of the US church, only 250, that's less than 1%, are Black. And out of 250 active bishops, only 8 of them are Black. The church, like all institutions in this country, is a house built on the foundation of white supremacist patriarchy and is definitely haunted by the ghost of slavery. But I won't go there tonight, not really. I'm here to speak about the intersection of environmental justice and racial justice in light of church social teaching. Right? So I won't list for you the myriad of ways of issues that we're facing globally. I won't talk about the issues of global food insecurity, of climate change, of immigration, the creation of false geopolitical borders, of the move to take away voting rights. I won't talk about despotic global leaders or the separation of children from their parents at the borders or clean water issues, nor will I bring up the insistence of being pro-life without a concern for all aspects of humanity at every stage of human life. What I will talk about is the inextricable link between environmental justice and racial justice. Right? In this country, the cancer rates and the asthma rates has taught us this fact, and the impact of COVID-19 has reiterated. Environmental issues disproportionately impact Blacks and people of color. People of color are more likely to be exposed to polluted air, polluted water, soil, and poor industrial working conditions. And as one member of the Black Lives Matter movement recently said, racism is endemic to global inequality. This means that those most affected and killed by climate change are poor and Black people. The research tells us in the United States, people of color disproportionately live in places that are polluted with toxic waste, which leads to higher instances of negative health effects such as cancer, asthma, degraded cardiac function, and high blood pressure. Not to mention, research has also highlighted that race is a stronger influence on exposure to pollutants than poverty. Let me say that again. Race is a stronger influence on exposure to pollutants than poverty. This means that it's likely that polluters not only cite their activities in low-income areas, but in some cases are actively selecting locations where there are high percentages of Black people in particular. Outside of the US, climate change and environmental degradation is disproportionately impacting people of color from poor countries, those in coastal or island communities who are being threatened by rising sea levels. Indigenous populations are deeply impacted by the criminal deforestation in the Amazon. There's water pollution throughout India and a growing desertification across the African continent. Given the another issue here, right, is the severe lack of diversity among the leadership of environmental organizations. And we know that policies adapted by environmental organizations have disproportionately penalized people of color through displacement or through restrictive policy. There are no colorblind policies. We know longstanding racist policies and practices, which I'm certain Allison can talk about in her legal background, such as residential segregation, unequal educational opportunities, and limited prospects for economic advancement, have led to increased vulnerability of Black people to climate change impacts, and by extension, other global crises that may emerge. If you don't believe me, we have an example here in our own backyard, Hurricane Katrina. Black communities, as I have said, are disproportionately located in areas most vulnerable to climate hazards, i.e. hurricanes and flooding. with unequal protection. In our instances, the federal levees fail to provide proper flood protection or levee protection for Black neighborhoods based on an unequal and racialized distribution of funding. We know that 80% of the homes lost in Hurricane Katrina belong to Black people, and that Black people made up over half of the total deaths. Let's also be clear that the recovery 15 years later has demonstrated the impact of racialized policy that sits atop the intersection of environmental justice and racial justice. Like Pope Francis, I urge us all to consider, one, the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet and the conviction that everything in this world is connected. I urge us to critique new paradigms and forms of power derived from technology. I urge us to seek alternative ways and understandings of the economy and progress. I urge you to consider all in the human family, every living thing on this planet as your brother and sister. More importantly, I urge you to consider the ways in which faith brings new incentives and new requirements to what it means to be a human being and our co-creation of the world. Finally, I ask you to consider what the Lord, what God, whomever you conceive her to be, requires of you. What does the Lord require of you? How will you practice justice? How will you love mercy? How will you walk humbly in spirit and in truth? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I'm grateful that you left us with some questions, and these might be questions that people could consider for our conversation and consider for their discernment. So thank you for that. I'd like to invite Allison McCrary to be the next presenter.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, David and Father Fred, for your amazing words. You took a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, so I will go through those parts pretty quickly. But first, I just want to give gratitude for all of you who took time on this Thursday evening while there's the debate going on and many other competing events to join us. And many of you on this call have decades of experience in the struggle for justice and contemplative practices more than I do. And folks like me proudly stand on your shoulders, and we try to step into the prophetic work that many of you laid a great foundation for us to continue on. And so just want to give a lot of gratitude for so many of you on this call. And I hope there's at least some little inkling of something possibly new that I have to share with you here. I want to start by saying that we are in a very difficult time, as you all know, and at the same time, God is pouring out into the world everywhere. This concept of Christogenesis, which is the unfolding of the divinity in space and time and the universe, is God coming in to be fully the Christ through creative union and love. And it's happening everywhere. During this time of COVID, as you walk down the street, take walks in your neighborhood, I hope you can see this unfolding of the divine in nature and in people and in all things, in spite of what is happening in the political climate. We're trying to grapple with a lot of different worldviews right now, and a lot of people are in completely different camps with blinders on. And religion and our contemplative practices have an important role to play during this time. Religion is more than an institutional commitment and going to church. It's this third dimension of a cosmic life and what it means to live into that. Religion gives us connection. Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist, spoke of religious experiences having evolutionary significance through the centration of the universe. But we have built this individualistic world of autonomy, and we have entered into this new era and created irreversible error with the environmental crisis. We've exacerbated this by our actions and by climate change. And if this time of this pandemic teaches us nothing else, it teaches us that nature doesn't need us, but we need nature. The Buddha said that the mind is everything, and whatever we think, we become. And so I invite all of us to try to enter into these higher levels of consciousness so that we can hold greater pain and suffering of the world, and so that God can bubble up in our lives as fidelity and love. I invite us to rejuvenate our contemplative dimensions of our lives and to maximize our awareness as we enter into the elections and the civil unrest after November 3rd, leading up to January 20th. I think that maximizing this awareness in our contemplative practices is going to be even more important. And when the level of our awareness changes and deepens, we start attracting this new reality, and it allows us to imagine and dream and live into this new world that we know we have the capacity to create with God, to co-create with God. And when our minds and our hearts expand in love, God is born in us and through us and into the universe. So we have to rethink and we have to refeel this earth and our community, this cosmic community, as our home. Heaven is not some other place, but heaven is earth and its fulfillment of its recognition of God in it. And I hope we can find that during this time. And I think we do that in a number of ways: by finding God in all things, by aligning with divine love, by knowing our potential to generate the more complex stages of evolution. And that can inform our practical action and contribute to the healing of the whole. I think we have to engage the differences to make a difference. This is really hard. It's hard within our own families with people who may not believe in climate change or who have different political views from us, but we have to engage in those differences in order to create the change that we want to see. We also have to believe in the transformative power of contemplation, along with the transformation of our consciousness. And this helps us evolve a new reality aligned with the divine mystery of God. We have to set an intention to be open to the divine energy moving within us, around us, and among us. And in aligning with this divine mystery, we align with divine love as well. And so I believe this is how we enter into this next stage of evolutionary consciousness. And we know that when we enter into these stages, that the energy fields forever change as we cultivate new energy and send that energy out into the world. Before I get into some of the meat of my presentation, there's a couple of themes that I want to highlight that have been pieces of my work. One is holding on to hope. And St. Augustine of Hippo has this quote that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, but the courage to change it. And so hope we can all hold on to hope during this time. Another theme is backing Indigenous leadership. I'm a tribal citizen of the Anianwea United Cherokee Nation and do a lot of Native liberation work with other women around the country and around the globe through a co-counseling practice. And we have to back Indigenous leadership in the environmental movement and find better ways of doing that. And we have to become knowledgeable of the evidence and the continually growing damage to the environment and to all life forms, especially as temperatures rise caused by our own human activities. And never before in human history have humans put their collective thought together to solve a collective problem like this. This is a very recent thing that around the globe we have this collective problem, both with climate change and with a pandemic, and we have to come together to collectively solve it. So we are shifting more and more from this idea of individualism to community mindset and seeing our interconnectedness. So I invite us to imagine as vividly as we can the world that we desire. It's a contradiction to live into this dream that we have, and to imagine the liberation and to really see the vision that is possible. So a little bit about myself. As I said, I'm a tribal citizen. I started Hildegard House of Hospitality here in New Orleans, giving hospitality to people who don't have housing elsewhere, coming out of ICE detention centers, transgender folks who may not feel welcome or have access to housing or homeless shelters, and others. I serve as a social justice movement lawyer. I'm a former Catholic sister and a restorative justice practitioner and mediator. I currently work as a movement capacity building strategist, working nationally with 50 nonprofits that are started and run by formerly incarcerated people, and served in a variety of other ministries and in different areas. I want to start a little bit about to share about contemplation. I think if our activism is not grounded in contemplation or spiritual practice, a lot of the activism lacks depth, groundedness, and sustainability. So contemplation awakens us into this new awareness of the divine indwelling in us. It's when our own being and the divine being become more and more mysteriously interwoven. It invites us into a direct experience of God. And we often don't learn contemplation growing up in the church. I didn't know what it was until about 12 years ago when I started the process of becoming a Catholic sister. And it was really the sisters who taught me how to pray and taught me how to deepen in my own contemplative practices. The early desert mothers and fathers and monks were practicing contemplation hundreds of years ago. And it's come back to our consciousness now with gratitude to folks like Thomas Keating and the Centering Prayer Movement, Thomas Merton, Evelyn Underhill, Cynthia Bourgeau, and others. It's returning today, I think, because there's a hunger for a spirituality that makes sense about what we know about the world today and about science. And our achievements alone give us no meaning. That's this myth of the individualist and individualism. And we're seeing more and more that we have to come together, and there's a hunger for community. We're starting to see that this divine is living in all of us, and we all have the potential for it. That contemplation is for everyone, that mysticism is a birthright for every person. And contemplation, it's this prayer without words, without images. It's not an emptying. It doesn't use intellect. It doesn't use emotions. And those aren't bad things, but it's this different thing. And the prayers that I learned to pray and trying to interpret all of these words in a lot of the prayers I was taught were very challenging for me. And in contemplation, I can let go of those words. I can enter into a more free experience and just enter into the presence of the divine. I can enter into a deep stillness. I quiet my mind. I don't have to look for answers to prayers or to anything. It's just entering into this transformative process. And so I invite us to continue to stay grounded in our contemplative practices as we engage in different movements and in the environmental rights movement. As I work with different activists around the country and around the globe, there's some characteristics that I've noticed among contemplative activists. One, they're grounded in spiritual practices. Two, they cultivate an inner life. Three, they work on decolonizing their lives and the systems that perpetuate colonized behaviors and mentalities. They practice deep listening and have a willingness to build power and challenge power. They follow leadership of those who are closest to the pain or closest to the problem, knowing that those are the people who are closest to the solutions. They practice genuine relationship building. They cultivate community. They have an ever-evolving and deepening political analysis, values, and language. And they take risk and they hold on to hope. And as I work with different activists, I've seen these different characteristics come up time and time again. And I offer these three questions for contemplative activists using the metaphor of a tree to ask these three questions of who are the people and what are the practices that keep you grounded? What are the roots of your tree? This is a picture of the tree of life in Audubon Park. What's in your tree trunk? What are your guiding principles and your values? And three, what are your tree branches? What are the outcomes that you want to see in the world as a result of your actions? And I'll put these in the chat box later and just invite you maybe before bed tonight to take out a blank sheet of paper, and if you want to have any art materials, to draw your tree and map these out for yourself to return back to. One of my experiences of contemplative activism started at St. Augustine Church after Hurricane Katrina and our struggle to keep St. Augustine Church in the Treme open. Many of you may be familiar with the struggle. When after the storm, Archbishop Hughes had set the church to be closed, and a group of us had occupied the rectory and for a month occupied the church, holding 24-hour vigils each day to keep the church open. And many Sundays at St. Augustine, we sing this song, Wade in the Water, the spiritual. And this ancient spiritual led the people from the continent of Africa who were forced into slavery to freedom, who were running away from enslavement by the European colonists. And it gave them hope for healing, that God would part the waters for them like the Red Sea and find a way forward. And I hope that we can hold on to that ancient hope today. And so at Mass, when we sing this song many Sundays, it's that hope that even in the midst of deep pain and suffering and death, that we can still hold on to hope and find a way forward. We live in this state of Louisiana that has a lot of environmental challenges, and a state with the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world, as David also talked about. Among the 50 states, Louisiana ranks first in crude oil production, first in outer continental shelf oil production, and first in natural gas production. This is these are maps of all of the gas pipelines and oil and drilling platforms along our coast. It looks like giant spider webs, which is all causing saltwater intrusion and taking away our land. The extent of offshore drilling for gas and oil in the Gulf, it's nothing short of staggering. There's more than 3,000 active oil wells in the waters of the Gulf, and over 25,000 miles of active oil and gas pipelines crisscrossing the Gulf of Mexico seafloor. And there's more than 18,000 miles of out-of-service pipelines there as well. This is a map of the slave plantations along the Mississippi River corridor, and they closely parallel where some prisons and jails were eventually built, as the 13th Amendment didn't abolish slavery, but just converted a lot of these plantations into prisons, and also into refineries and communities of color, mostly Black and Indigenous communities along the Mississippi River corridor, known as Cancer Alley. So this is a map of all of the chemicals that are in our air, our water, and our soil, and in the soil and water and air of all of our neighbors. And our addictions to oil, gas, and petrochemical products like plastic, they perpetuate the land, human, and economic exploitation by corporations on these communities of colors and the ecological systems along the Mississippi River. It's this continued presence of these industries of extraction that create and perpetuate oppression by those who are most vulnerable. This is Norco, Louisiana, which some of you may be familiar with the factories there and have visited there for protests. This is gas flare, and gas flares like this occur regularly, and they can last for days or for weeks. Gas flaring, it's the deliberate open air burning of natural gas, and it's a byproduct of oil extraction. As you drive along I-10 and look over the river and lakes, you'll often see these gas flares in the night sky. The burning of methane from these gas flares, it produces massive greenhouse gases that advance global warming and create a smelly and noisy environment with 24/7 bright skies, where exposures to it cause headaches and dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and loss of coordination in people and animals. Corporations could be taxed on this methane that they release, but that's yet to happen. We also have a large number of petrochemical industry accidents, and these happen regularly without the public being alerted or notified in a timely manner. And people are often exploited in the cleaning up of it. So like the BP oil spill, a lot of the cleanup was done by inmate labor. Organizations like the Louisiana Bucket Brigade are give out these EPA certified buckets so people can test their own water and soil and air and send it into the EPA for testing. And there's a lot of other local organizing efforts too that I put in the chat box earlier. the Coalition Against Death Alley, the Concerned Citizens of St. John, the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition, the Green Army, the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, the New Orleans People's Assembly that's advocating for a fully funded relocation of Gordon Plaza, the Prosperity Project of Louisiana, Rise St. James, and Together Louisiana. Many of you may be familiar with Amendment 5 that's currently on the ballot. Not sure how much we can talk about it on this call for political reasons, but you can get a free yard sign, and there's education calls every Thursday. You can sign up for the next education call next Thursday at prosperityproject.la to learn more about Amendment 5. I want to leave you with a few questions for creating social change. So one is to know what your theory of social change is. So how do you believe social change happens? Who are you accountable to, and what is their theory of social change? And 3, how are the tactics that you're employing working towards realizing your theory or theories of social change? And if your theory of change is based in a power-based theory of change, how are those tactics helping grow an organized base of directly impacted people and building up community leadership as you do that? So those are the questions I'll leave you with. I'll put those in the chat if you would like to reflect on those more later.
All right. Thank you, Allison, so much. What rich and complimentary, I have to say, presentations. We thought we would give each of the panel members a very brief minute or two. If there are any things that struck you, any ends you want to tie together, and we'll kind of go in the same order. Briefly, Fred, any follow-up reflections?
I guess I would highlight 3 things. One from David, the tie of the explicit tie of environmental justice to racial justice. And I did not realize, David, that was interesting to me, that race more strongly correlates with exposure to pollution than poverty does. That was an interesting thing for me. I mean, I knew that both were such important factors, but that was really helpful. Secondly, I think from Allison, just an array of practical actions. And I think it gives everybody lots of groups they can plug into and connect to, et cetera. Third, from Allison, the emphasis on hope. And I'm going to share this short quote from Václav Havel, the Czech poet who spoke in '86 in Philadelphia about hope. He said, either we have hope within us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the heart, an orientation of the spirit. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. And lastly, he says, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It is this hope above all, which gives us the strength to live and continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. That last sentence was spoken in Philadelphia 3 years before the wall fell, the communist wall fell in his country. It reflects what hope is about, that we commit ourselves to what is good and right, even if it's against overwhelming odds, and even if it doesn't stand, quote, a chance to succeed. So I thank Allison for the emphasis upon hope.
Thank you, Fred. David, any brief kind of synthesis or follow-up reflections?
Yes, first, wow. Those were great. I think from Fred, what struck me really is this call for us to engage as co-creators, right? That we are called to be co-creators in God's creation and co-creators of the earth. You know, all of them sort of intertwine this notion of humanity, right? And so again, a lot of my research sort of centers on what it means to be a human being, right? But I've been working with other groups and with other Catholic dioceses around the country. And my question to them at my first meeting is, or my exercise is for them to close their eyes and to picture God. right? We are created in the image and likeness of God. Close your eyes and picture God. Sit with that for a minute. Then I asked them to open their eyes and tell me what God looked like. Right? And most often, the answer is a white man with a beard, right? And even from people who look like me, God looks like a white man with a beard. And I use that as the entry point to say how deeply entrenched the church is in this notion of white supremacy, right? That even God, our picture of God, is a white man. That's some deep, deep stuff, right? That's some deep indoctrination. And so I challenge folks to sort of work through that. And I bring that up because each of these talk about humanity and humanity being created in the image and likeness of God. So if the likeness of God for us is a white man, right, then what humanity are we serving, right? How do we define that notion of humanity? The other piece from Allison, what really struck me is this notion of wholeness, right? And the root of holiness is wholeness, is to be one. And so the act of contemplation, right, allows you to be one with yourself, allows you to be one with God, with nature, with everything. And those two, now I'm just lecturing, but those two things really struck me. And you know, the question that I had for Allison was the same question someone put in the chat here. Talk to us about how one decolonizes their life, right? That question about picturing God is a question of decolonization, right? It's reversing the indoctrination. And that is so critical of a question.
David, thank you so much. And finally, Allison, a brief follow-up or connection or synthesis?
Wow, so much has been said, and I feel like I know I talked over my time, so apologies for that. I think Father Fred, just listening to you talk and listening to how the church has evolved over time and trusting that it can evolve, and what is our role in the institution's evolution. Even it's one of the things that I feel like I have no power within, but seeing that it can and does change. And David, knowing that all of our struggles are intersectional, and highlighting the intersections of racism and climate change and speciesism, where we put one species over another, and sexism, all of those are present. And the question around decolonizing our lives, I think so much of it is about awareness. Even when we think about the elections that are coming up, and we hear things about defunding the police or abolition of the police. Until the colonists arrived, there were no prisons, there were no police. There was conflict, and there was violence, and there was accountability for harm that was done. And it was done through restorative justice. It was done by holding circles of people, of the people who were impacted by the harm and the person or people who caused the harm. We didn't have police. We didn't have people kept in cages. And so a piece of decolonizing is just freeing our imagination from these constructs and deinstitutionalizing ourselves, and getting free from that which really doesn't serve us or humanity, that tears families apart, strips people of their humanity, dignity, and to really reimagine another way of doing it and putting energy into creating it. We're always fighting against things, but what are we working towards building? And I've really been trying to, when people pull me into a movement or into a campaign, I'm always struggling with, I want to put my time and energy into creating the new. How are we creating a new way of doing this rather than just fighting constantly against what isn't working?
Thank you so much to Allison and to all three of you. Like I say, I really found we didn't do a whole lot of preparation. We just exchanged a few emails, but I really feel like the presentations tonight fit beautifully together, really complemented and completed each other. So that was really beautiful. So thank you all. Allison, maybe I'll just start off. Could you tell us what's Amendment 5? And I think we all give you permission to tell us what it's about.
Great. And I also just, I know we're not in webinar mode, and I know there's some folks who are working a lot closer on Amendment 5 than I am. And so I invite you to chime in as you are able. But let's see, I'm going to share my screen again real quick. If that's all right. So the Prosperity Project of Louisiana and General Honore put together this little flyer on 7 things to know about Amendment 5 before voting. And so the language of the text says, and many of you hopefully have already early voted, so you've seen it, but it says, do you support an amendment to authorize local governments entering into a cooperative endeavor, ad valorem tax exemptions with new or expanding manufacturing establishments for payments in lieu of taxes? And so very wordy, very confusing. What does it mean? This would give more resources and funding to oil and gas corporations. It would allow big corporations to be able to negotiate whether or not they pay their property taxes. So I summarize it here in 7 points. So 1, it comes from a proposed deal that was declared unconstitutional when this deal with this one corporation. 2, it only made it on the ballot because we were on a stay-at-home order. And so industry lobbyists pushed it through the legislature when they weren't looking at any other bills, and no one, we were all trying to figure out how to stay alive. 3, again, it would allow corporations to negotiate whether they pay property taxes, how much, if anything, they pay, and they can name their price instead of paying the tax rate that we approve. It doesn't require any job creation to get this tax exemption for corporations. It wouldn't have any time limits on its negotiated tax deals. It would create more tax loopholes that would never expire. And so some corporations would have to pay little or no money indefinitely. And it would increase taxes for all residents and most businesses. And it will take money away from schools, roads, and other public services. So it's money that could be going to other things from tax revenue. It's going to take money away from that. So that's why there's a big movement to say no on Amendment 5.
All right. Well, thank you, Allison. I think that's helpful for people to know who haven't voted. I stood in line at the Smoothie King Center this morning and voted, and that was a good experience, actually. All right. Brenda asks, how can individual parishes, what can individual parishes do, Fred, David, Allison, to address environmental justice? So this is really an action question for people in the pew.
Mm-hmm. In summary, educate, organize, mobilize. If you have a social justice committee, a lot of the social justice committees focus on direct services and food distribution, important things, but direct services. No, a lot of them don't focus on systemic change. So challenge them, bring up these issues, educate and organize. You can do it by Zoom now. You can get more people actually on. People don't have to drive.
Good. Fred or David?
Well, yeah, people might want to log into a group called the Catholic Climate Covenant, which is a group of Catholic organizations committed about environmental justice and responsibility. And there's a St. Francis pledge in there that's about 1 sentence, but it's about changing individual lifestyles, organizations, et cetera. And there's a lot of work going on actually right now among Catholic organizations about how to reduce their carbon usage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of resources at something like the Catholic Climate Covenant that people can take a look at. I know also that the Nation Solidarity Network has got some resources on environment as well for parishes and others to take a look at as well. So the Catholic Climate Covenant and the Nation Solidarity Network, I would check those websites.
And Fred, you put this down earlier, but your own JSRI has regular newsletters and things like that.
Right.
Good. David, any thoughts from you about how parishes might, individual parishes might address this?
So I agree with Allison and Fred. Do all of those things they just told you to do, but also model the way, right? It's not enough just to learn about it, to read about it, to talk about it, but you have to do it. And so I would encourage you to develop a committee, sit down with your pastor, and see what things that that your parish can model, right? To become more green, to begin to be more friendly to the environment. Those are very small steps, but I feel like once we begin to model it for folks and to show how easy it is, and how necessary it is to be aware, as Allison pointed out, and conscious of things that we're doing, our behaviors change over time.
Tom,
Matt,
Tom,
go
I
ahead,
would
Fred.
add, there are materials and ways of dealing with this also at every level of the parish religious education programs. And kids actually are much more alert to these issues than adults are. But there are things that can be done in sacramental preparation programs, in Catholic education, in Catholic schools, high schools, et cetera, at all levels. And there are a lot of resources out there for people to look at in parishes and parish institutions.
Good, good. And then a couple of comments from the audience. Matt Russo says that parishes could really promote and reflect on Laudato Si. That remains such a rich, such a rich resource. And sadly, we haven't probably reflected on it as nearly as much as we should. And then Brenda Williams suggests kind of framing this as a life issue, as a respect life issue, so broadening what that means. So I guess would either of you want to comment on that? Should we frame environmental justice, and what advantage would there be to doing that as a respect life issue?
Well, it really is a life issue. The other resource too that parishes might reflect on is the exhortation on the Amazon, where Francis really focuses a lot. And it's interesting, he hits on some themes like that Allison did. He talks about the importance of outrage and environmental destruction. He talks about the importance of love leading to justice. He talks about contemplation, which Allison was focusing on, and he talks about the personal conversion from consumerism. So there's a lot there in that. I would look at both Laudato Si and the Amazon exhortation as well as the new thing on Fratelli Tutti.
Fratelli Tutti, we just had a discussion of it in the Institute for Ministry today. I was actually surprised at how little, it has a lot of implications for environmental justice, but it doesn't address it as explicitly as I thought it might. But it's a great and it's powerful, but I was a little surprised by that. But
well, it's really about life across the species. I mean, it's not just about human life, but it's really about life across the species, all of the earth, and the integralness that Alice has talked about when we contemplate nature and all the various interrelatedness we have. And I think that's where Benedict, a lot of us look on him as a conservative theologian, but Benedict's work, when he talks about a covenant between human beings and creation, is very, very important. And so is John Paul's stuff about talking about being co-creator that David picked up on, that we are not, it's not, because a lot of environmentalists had criticized the Judeo-Christian tradition that that Genesis was sort of saying you could rape the earth, which it doesn't say. It says, be to the earth as I am to the earth, which means that we have to be intimately related to the earth and nurturing creation at large. And that fits right in with the whole spectrum of life issues.
Climate change, the impact on the environment impacts us all. I don't care what color you are. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care what age you are. I don't care anything about that. You will be impacted by it. It's the one thing that will affect all of humanity. And as human beings, we have an innate desire to survive, right? As creatures. And this is about survival, right? At the end of the day, it's about survival.
Could you isolate one point in your experience, one point in your life where you said, aha, environmental justice? So what was there one thing that really moved you to say, this is really important?
Tom, I was in Brazil in 1989 visiting Jesuits working down there, and it was in Recife. The Jesuits there took us out to the dump, and actually the Jesuit novitiate there was built near the dump, and there were three groups of people scavenging, three groups of species scavenging the dump. There were pigs, and there were kind of carrion crows, and there were human beings. And riding along, I passed a little girl who may have been 8, 10 years old, beautiful young woman there. And Jesuit touring us explained about how the poor there were harvesting whatever they could find to survive on from the dump, that they were looked down upon by other poor people, and that many of them were becoming permanently ill because of breathing the fumes and everything from the dump. And it was just a moment of blending together the poverty issues, and humanity issues, et cetera, with the devastation of the environment.
Powerful. How about you, David or Allison? Could you name a point?
Allison, you want to go? You want me to go?
It doesn't. Go ahead.
Well, for me, so I've had lots of mini lives. And at one point in my life, at least in middle school, I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. And so I grew up in Galveston, Texas. I grew up on an island. I grew up on the water. And I thought, okay, I'll be a marine biologist, right? That later transferred into a calling into the seminary, which I did and did not stay very long because it wasn't the right place for me. But it was, I think it was then. And then realizing the sort of majesty of the creator and all of the creations, and how everything living on a barrier island is interconnected. That was point one. I think when I really became conscious of it, though, is that Hurricane Katrina moment. Is that moment I was in college here, graduated after Hurricane Katrina, and began to work at the mayor's office as that mayor's senior publicist, working on rebuilding the city, right? And realizing, touring these areas, how impacted they were, and which areas were most impacted, right? And I'm talking every day to people who look like me, right? I'm not uptown, I'm not in the quarter, but I'm in the Lower Nine, I'm in Gentilly, and you realize, for me, that was the realization of that intersection, right, of racial justice and environmental justice.
That's powerful.
Yeah, I think just briefly, for me, it was being on growing up on the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas. And my uncle Frank, who was Native and most carried on our Native traditions, he worked on fishing boats as his full-time work, and just his passion for keeping the oceans clean and going out with him and picking up any kind of trash, and just this connection to the water and the land and our connection to it, and how essential it is for our own survival and our connection to food.
That's great. It's interesting. Kathleen has a comment about pets. That's a complex thing, isn't it? She says it's puzzling for me. The focus of society for the care and maintenance of pets are over love, concern for fellow human beings. Would you all want to say anything about that? And you go to. I'll just add a little more. But you go to a store and you see these fine pet foods, refrigerated pet foods that are very expensive and have large carbon footprints. And yet, I have to say, we have a cat at home, and that cat brings joy to our household. So that's Kathleen. I think you raise a really important point. Would the panel like to say anything about that?
Yeah. I have my little coworker here behind me. You can see her napping. She's always lazy on the job, my cat. But yeah, I think there is definitely something to say about that, especially as we talk about keeping people in cages and racism and the immigrant detention centers, mass incarceration, all of those issues, and connecting that. Yeah, like, what do we prioritize? But it's, and we also cannot connect it to that. That is very problematic in many ways. But I think we have to look at speciesism. I think there's a lot to learn from the vegan and vegetarian movement around speciesist, and to think about, like, what species do we prioritize? Like, what animals do we see as cute, and which ones do we see as okay to kill, and how does that impact our ecosystem?
That's interesting. Matt says pet in Spanish is ornament. Very interesting. Fred or David, anything? Or
Yeah, I think to Kathleen, to your point, I've written about this some when the lion was killed all those years back, and there was this huge outrage. And I think, to be quite simple and quite blunt, it is uninterrogated racism and white supremacy, and uninterrogated classism, that we would care more for, not that pet shouldn't be cared for, but that we would care more for a pet than we would our literal DNA brother or sister. Right? Those are issues for me, and those are conversations, even in this conversation about the environment, environmental justice. Right? We sort of shied away from the racial justice aspect because we're not ready to confront our own prejudices, right? Our own biases, which we all have. Everyone has implicit bias, right? It keeps us alive. But this issue around, and I was so enraged when everyone was, outcry about this lion, and I'm thinking, a man was just gunned down in the street, and you turn a blind eye, or you pray for him for a moment in the prayers of the faithful, yet you are crying about a lion that was killed, right? I feel for the lion, but I feel more for the man who looks like me, who was gunned down in the street, right? And so I think we have, again, that question about reckoning. We have some reckoning to do, right? If we have lied about God, then we've lied about everything. And I think we have to get with that point, right?
that's great. Good. Well, I wonder, we said we would go till 8:30, and maybe just one more quick question. Ben Gordon offers a book here that he suggests, but I'm wondering if each of you could say, like, what's one thing that you would either recommend for yourself or for us, as a kind of flowing out of this webinar. If you could say, the webinar has ended, go in peace and do X. What would that be? Or yourself, what would you want to hold yourself to, one or the other of that?
Tom, are you inviting all of us, or just the panel?
Well, I was gonna invite the panel, but if you maybe if the audience wants to chime in or type in or something like that, we could do that.
Yeah, maybe folks can put it in the chat. Like, what are you taking away from this, or what one thing?
Yeah.
What's the next action you're going to do tomorrow or next week or next month?
There you go. So that would be a nice thing. Could people, while the panel is sharing their reflections, could the audience kind of type in their reflections? Maura, did you want to say something?
As somebody who's challenged by the chat, I haven't quite figured out how to do that. I just want to say briefly, I think what I'm taking away from this experience is, Alison referred to it, freeing our imaginations to think outside the box. If we really contemplate who we are, and what creation is as an epiphany of God.
Mm,
Yeah,
beautiful.
I think
Beautiful.
it brings about conversion.
Mm, that's beautiful. Ben writes, living simply so that others can simply live. Good, lovely. So how about to the panelists? What would, if you, what would you want people really to take away, or yourself to take away from this?
I think for me, my homework is always to deepen my own contemplative practices and to not, you know, the activism is there, but to always continue going deeper and cultivate my own practices internally, to come from a place of groundedness and rootedness and connectedness, and to keep finding God in my garden and nature, and staying connected that way. I would invite all of you here. You know, we're tremendously blessed in this state with some amazing activists, Black activists, Indigenous activists who are leading our environmental rights movement. That's not the case in most places. It's a very white movement, as many of you know. And there are folks who need your help and support. Just last week, I had 3 different groups, all led by Black women, contact me needing their 501c3 incorporation for an environmental nonprofit. They're in rural areas in Louisiana who are fighting against these old corporations, and they need your support. I listed some of them in the chat, but you know, the Concerned Citizens of St. John, the Coalition Against Death Alley, the Greater New Orleans Climate Coalition, and Pastor Greg Manning, the New Orleans People Assembly, Rise St. James. We are tremendously blessed with a lot of great activists who are really close to the problems here, and we need to follow their leadership and follow their guidance and support them and back them and fund them. And so however you can do that, connect with them, look them up online, follow them on social media, call them up, an old-fashioned phone call. That's how you can support.
All right. David or Fred?
Well, I'm thinking in light of what Ellison said, that upcoming is the collection for the Campaign for Human Development. I know that the Campaign for Human Development is helping to fund at least Rise St. James. And so you might just think about that collection, which is to fund community organizing across the country and in our own diocese. It's a good thing. And the collection's usually taken up around Thanksgiving. I'm not sure what Sunday it'll be in every Catholic church, but it's a November event.
Good, all right. David, how about you?
For me, I think the one thing that that I'm taking away is that I need to be more contemplative, and I need to find more time for stillness and peace. Don't look at me like that, Kathleen Dorsey Bello, but I'm doing my best. I think what I want others to take away is that at this moment in human history, understanding that leads to action trumps compassion. And, you know, release yourself of the fear of gaining a deeper understanding. Release yourself of the fear of being wrong about something. Release yourself of the fear of the other, because they are you. That's what I want to do.
David, could you say something about the distinction between understanding and compassion? That's an interesting connection you make there.
So I think, and Allison and Fred hop in too, because maybe I'm wrong about this, right? But understanding for me is an active engagement, and it's typically done through dialogue, right? Which is deep listening, intentional speech. The act of compassion is wonderful, but it's oftentimes very passive, and it does not lead, in my opinion, to action. And not that prayer isn't an action, but the issues that we have, we cannot pray away, right? We need active work. We need active understanding.
That's beautiful. That's great. Well, I want to again call everybody's attention to the chat. There are a number of people who have posted some good reflections there, saying, Brenda says, I'm going to start by addressing environmental justice in my own community in light of this, I'm sure. Jason, increased personal activity in social justice causes. Ben, about the importance of hope. And then Allison has listed a number of good organizations here. We'll record this and we'll get this out to you, so you'll be able to see the PowerPoint with a lot of that material in it. Jennifer Rogers talks about our parish's work and working the clergy to promote these issues, and kind of seeing respect life issues in a broader context.
Tom, this is Fred. Let me underscore something David just said about when he's talking about compassion.
Sure.
There's a piece from John Paul II when he's talking about solidarity, and he talks about it as a virtue. And as I always say to people, it wasn't on any of the virtue list in my catechism. But he says, this then is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it's a firm and persevering commitment to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we really are responsible for all. All.
Where does he say that, Fred?
I think it's from Solicitudo Rei Socialis. I can look.
Okay.
Later.
Good. That's a beautiful quote.
Yeah, it's a great thing. He did a lot of stuff about solidarity there.
That's great. Well, panelists, like I say, this was really a rich evening. And I think you all complemented each other beautifully, and really give us things to think about, but not just to think about, but to put our bodies into, to act on. So I think we're all speaking on behalf of the Rapolo Endowment Committee. I'd like to thank you all, and speaking, I think, on behalf of all the attendees, I'd like to thank you all. I think this was really a rich conversation. It's so important. So maybe if everybody could kind of join me in giving a visual clap to you all. So